Good morning and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the collective unconscious. So, this big matrix of thought, feeling, ancestral information, and even behavior that gets deposited into the collective psyche. So, let's jump in. So, up to this point, the two key terms that we've discussed is taking a look at the shadow or the underbelly and really pulling in the parts of us that we reject or don't like or even strongly dislike, and seeing them as a way to understand our own inner workings and identify the parts and places that we reject in ourselves. And we know that the shadow can operate on both an individual level as well as a social level. We also have discussed thus far just archetypes, or the idea that we have motifs or imprints and images that come really, really deep in our human psyche and can be seen and witnessed across cultures and across religion and across art and spirituality. So Jung's first kind of core archetypes were around the spiritual being, so the wise one or the sage, also around legacy, like the hero or heroine's journey, so that hero quality of leaving a legacy behind, as well as structure, kind of building an archetype or an architecture for society. And then also connection, which we get the motifs and images of lover, mother, father, that sort of thing. So, those are both aspects that exist within the collective unconscious. And so, today we're going to take a deeper look at what Jung termed as inner work or inner gardening. He was the first person to really articulate that the mind needed this inner pruning. So we'll look at that, as well as discuss brain waves and how they relate to dream states. And we will do a dream application from our reading with Whitman and Pereira, where we talk about feeling, association, and amplification. There'll also be a handout for you. So if you want to go back and review some of these terms, they're there for you as well. Let's jump in. The term collective unconscious first appeared in Jung's essay in 1916. When it came up, it was referred to as the structure of the unconscious. This essay distinguishes between Freud's personal unconscious, which he believed was really rooted in desire, and dreams were also just a manifestation of desire, whereas the Freudian idea of the unconscious was filled with sexual fantasies or repressed images, and the collective really encompasses the soul and humanity at large. And so that's, again, a distinction between the unconscious in a Freudian sense in psychodynamics and a Jungian sense within psychodynamic psychology. So let's jump in. All these bright colors, collective unconscious. So in his first paper, Carl Jung, he referred to the collective unconscious as a gateway that he referred to as the significance of constitution and heredity in psychology, published in 1929. So this quote says, essentially, psychology, that is dreams, fantasy, and other exceptional states of mind, is the most far-fetched mythological motifs and symbols. They can appear at any time and often appear as a result of traditions or working on the individual. But often they operate without any sign of them. So they're very hidden, they're very latent. And these primordial images, as I have called them, and this is Carl Jung speaking, belong to the basic stock of the unconscious psyche and cannot be explained as a personal acquisition. Together, they make up a psychic stratum that has been called the collective conscious. And I really like this term, psychic stratum. So it's the idea that we're constantly kind of swimming in an invisible, latent soup, if you will, the psychic stratum that we're all part of, but it's not often visible. So I kind of think very much like a spider web. There are aspects that are visible, but absolutely some glue pulling it together. He also believed that the collection of unconscious can refer to inherited predispositions. The collective unconscious compromises itself of the psychic life of our ancestors and the earliest non-human beings. And this piece right here of being comprising the psychic life of our ancestor feels important, not just from a biological perspective, but also one of inheritance. As we know in many cultures, for example, in the I Ching, it discusses how an action of someone's forefather or foreancestor can trickle down both positively and negatively for 7 generations. So in the I Ching, if your parent has been studying spiritual practices and meditating and spent time in monasteries and is living a pure lifestyle, then it makes it easier for the offspring to also achieve enlightenment. And by the same token, if there's a lot of darkness and unprocessed shadow work in the family story, then that also gets passed down for 7 generations, according to the I Ching, which is a Taoist text from China. And I'm sure that if we collectively put our brains together, we could also come up with other examples of this ancestral transmission, both from a scientific perspective and from perspectives of different cultures across the world. So really neat to think about. It's also been referred to as the matrix. Yeah, as you like picture all the green digits coming down the screen. So the matrix of conscious psychic occurrences and access to this awareness, or having access points to our collective unconscious, is actually freedom at the highest degree. So I think this is really exciting because in modern society, there's this notion that freedom is tied to material wealth, right? Because then you can go and do places or travel. But it's really the opposite of that, that freedom in the highest degree is just being able to access the collective unconscious for data, material, stories, behaviors, all those sorts of things. So really neat that we are collectively anchoring our freedom. So the psychic stratum, aka the collective unconscious, also housed 5 primary activities, according to Carl Jung's 1929 essay. He espoused that the instincts that can emerge from this are going to be hunger. That makes sense, right? As sexuality, activity, so any type of movement, and any type of self-reflection, as well as creativity. So in his early years, he compared these to some of Freudian drives, the sexuality, the hunger, the basic needs. But you can see where there's this layer of higher thinking and higher consciousness, kind of like the 7th or 5th or 6th chakra, of also adding in, what about self-reflection? What about creativity and that creative expression and just activity in our life? So he believed that some of these preferences also emerge from the collective unconscious. And later scholars who read his work, there's a Jungian Institute where you can go and attend, and most attendees are 40s or 50 and in their 40s, 50s and older. And it requires that you already have a clinical degree, and then you do deeper studies. So in addition to the 300 hours of practicing Jungian psychology, it's another 300 more to do psychodynamic work. And so those that came after him really put a large emphasis on the psychic stratum, or the collective unconscious, having 3 levels. So a lower level, a mid, and a spiritual level of higher forces. So what comes out of, or what gets birthed from the collective unconscious, can be shadow work, aka lower forces of undigested, unprocessed aspects that we reject, or even the binary really lives in the shadow. And then higher spiritual forces, things like religious motifs. If we look at myth and story, maybe angels or varies. So there can also be higher spiritual forces that come from the psychic stratum that we all have access to. And it also is where hunger, sexuality, activity, reflection, and creativity emerge from as well. Oh my gosh, look at how beautiful this picture is. And maybe if you're listening, you don't see it, but let me give you the overview. There's this beautiful little tree that has a little crook, and there's a nice stream, and it's really, really green. It looks like it's somewhere in Ireland or maybe the Pacific Northwest, where it's just green and really mossy, and it's a beautiful garden. And so I chose this image as a representation of inner work because Jung compared this inner psychology to tending to ourself, tending to our needs as something that we have to check in with, just like we brush our teeth to make sure they're clean. We also have to clean up or plant new seeds or dig up dead bushes from our own inner workings. So he believed that the purpose of inner work was tending to the blueprint of aspects of the self that are both conscious and unconscious. He interpreted psychology not solely as a collection of theories, but an applied practice. And I love that piece, right? Because it's not just like, how do we think about why the human does this behavior? Or why do we think about, so, we think about attachment theory of how really early bonding with a parent and a caregiver shapes the brain and creates things like neurological attunement. That's the why, but how do we apply it? And so in this way, we can think about, oh my gosh, there's a matrix of the collective unconscious, but how do we apply it? So this was the application, was inner work, was gardening of the mind. Through it, we nurture our psyche and allow it to grow. It often needs pruning and tending. And so how do we tend? Journaling, writing down what comes up, creative artwork. And that might just be something like weaving a basket, or it might be cooking and really being with the flavors and the smells, anything that's mindful that allows us to tend to that artwork. Things like active imagination, and of course, movement. So we know there's things like dance therapy or somatic therapy. We're really situated in how movement and things like interpretive dance are able to voice what sometimes is unconscious and latent and unnameable. So these are some of the purposes of inner work. Jung also has a great quote that I'd like to share with you. About dreams. And so I feel like it's relevant also as we talk about inner work, right? We named journaling and active imagination and movement, but this really comes into what we're here to do, which is study dream. So to concern ourselves with dreams is a way of reflecting on ourselves, not the ego or the desire, but the self. It recollects that strange self, alien to the ego, which was ours from the beginning. The trunk from which the ego grew is alien to us because we have estranged ourselves from it, the ego, through aberrations of the conscious mind. How beautiful, just thinking that in our dream world, the ego self gets suspended, and we really get to see the trunk from which the ego grew. So again, so exciting. We're doing so much self-study and inner pruning. So elements from the collective unconscious often manifest in groups of people who by definition share connection to all of the elements we've discussed. And what's important to know is that groups of people can become especially receptive to specific symbols. And that's often due to historical situations you find yourself in. Like, if we were to see like the Shell gas station, we would know based on the logo which gas station it was. Or if you were to see a check mark that says do it, you're like, oh, clearly that's KFC. Just kidding. It's Nike, right? But there are these images that when they are repeated, they enter into the psyche. So things code into our personal psyche through repetition, peer groups, and authority figures, and often trauma as well. So if we have that repetition and we see it, then it's entering the unconscious mind. So this happens at a group level as well for Jung. The common importance of the collective unconscious is to make people ripe for political manipulation, especially in the era of global politics. So again, the collective unconscious isn't a neutral place. It can also hold shadow work and be really intense. And while we can pull through higher archetypes, like angels or sage or wisdom, we can also pull through lower archetypes like political manipulation. And so Jung compared mass movements to mass psychosis. And you have to remember his context, right? He was alive and working, just before World War I. And so he was absolutely aware of propaganda and agenda and how that could be twisted and how the shadow and the collective unconscious really played into social movements. So he believed that the unconscious symbolism through social dynamic flow created followers or people who were blindly with the sheep mob or the archetype of group think, where they weren't thinking for themselves. And again, he has the quote, "It's easier to judge than it is to think." And so I think that really plays through when we are applying the collective inner work to social movements. So before I transition, I just want to note then the antidote perhaps to shadow movements and political manipulation would actually be teaching people self-study. And how exciting is that? Because encouraging someone to look at their own inner shadow is definitely a way to ameliorate polarization and war and injustice, is that self-study piece. So pretty neat. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about brain waves. So I'll give you a moment just to look through the slide. And if you'd like, maybe you want to draw them down for your notes, 4 different types of brainwave states that we're going to talk about. All right, so we know that beta is an awake and alert state, and alpha is going to be a bit more calm, relaxed, lucid. You're not really thinking. And then theta, 4 to 8 hertz, is going to be deep relaxation, meditation, mental image. And delta at 1 to 3 hertz is this dream, deep sleep state. So again, beta, 14 to 30 hertz, you're alert, you're aware, you're awake. It's kind of like you've had a cup of coffee and you're getting ready to give a board meeting. There's just a certain amount of anxiety, if you will, that's keeping you going. And then with the alpha state, it's just kind of like this is maybe in your day when you're doing something a bit mindless, but you're present for it. You're relaxed, you're thinking at 9 to 13 hertz. And then theta is 4 to 8 just before you sleep. And delta can be that dreamless state. So this little quote here comes from an article called Various Brainwaves Function from Neuroscience magazine. And I really liked it because I thought this first line was funny. It's well known that the brain is an electrochemical organ. It's like, is it really? I don't often think of the brain as an electrical chemical organ that can power electricity. So I thought that was kind of funny. It's like, oh yeah, everyone knows that your brain can power a light bulb. It's like, really? I did not know that. But this is from an individual, Ned Herman, who studies models of brain activity, and he started a group called the Ned Herman Group in 1980, where he does education at General Electric about the power of the brain. So he says, researchers have speculated that a fully functioning brain can generate as much as 10 watts of electrical power. Other more conservative investigators calculate that if all 10 billion interconnected nerve cells were discharged at one time, that a single electrode placed on the human scalp would record something like 5 millionths, and I don't have a good context or comprehension what a 5 millionth is of a volt. So in short, if you had enough scalps, you'd be able to light up a flash bulb. Pretty cool. It's kind of like Monsters Inc. when the children cry, they can like light a city, but they realize that if they're just as happy, they light a city. So yes, we definitely have electrical power in our bodies and our brains. So the four main kind of primary states of the brain, we discussed beta, alpha, theta, delta, and then gamma is going to be more of the extremes. So we see often gamma states with people like PTSD or anxiety. It's just a really, really high, almost panic level that we don't often need to get to, but it's still within range of the human brain. So humans dream in 90-minute cycles. And when we're dreaming, the delta brainwave frequency increases. So just before you're going to sleep, you're at theta state. And then when you start to dream, you're moving towards delta. Active dreaming often takes place and becomes more experiential in the delta state. And we know that active dreams occur with rapid eye movement, which is a characteristic of actively dreaming. And we call this rapid eye movement REM. So it's really neat because what we're doing in this class is we're talking about tools to get really in tune with the delta state and the theta state. And with the delta state, what's fascinating is that place just before sleep. It's also techniques that are used in modern counseling and psychology and psychiatry, such as EMDR. So eye movement desensitization reprogramming. So Robin Shapiro was the first person to come up with this model of having someone go back to their dream state or to an active dream state where they imagine a traumatic event. And then through replaying the traumatic event, but being in a safe place and giving the brain electrical stimulation, it helps to tease apart neural pathways that have fired together and hence wired together. So with this activity of going back and seeing the same memory again and again and again, it desensitizes the neural pathways. And she initially thought like, oh, it must be because of the rapid eye movement. And later in the research studies realized that it wasn't about the rapid eye movement. It was really about the frequency that was at. So it didn't matter that the eyes were going fast. It was really just getting into the delta state. So being able to access this point of theta delta and do some lucid dreaming and be able just to notice your dreams is really helpful because it's a healing tool that you can use yourself. You don't need to go see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Of course, it's always really helpful to have someone hold space and point out blind spots, but this is just a tool that you can be using to prune and tend to your inner garden. All right, so that was a little bit about the different brainwave states that we work with. And so now let's jump in, now that we know our brain can power a light bulb, and talk about some dream work. Reservoir of feelings. To concern self with dream is a way on reflecting on ourself, not the ego, but on the self and previous recollections. How cool, right? So when we're dreaming, it's not like an ego thing, but it's really looking at the totality of self and being able to understand different versions of us. The conscious mind becomes a reservoir of feeling, thought, urges, memories that are outside of our awareness. And the unconscious contains the contents that are unacceptable, unpleasant, and can even house feelings of pain, anxiety, or conflict. So even though we don't walk around maybe with feeling upset about something all the time, that would be maladaptive, it just kind of gets pushed and hidden in the unconscious aspects. So let's talk about some emotions, feelings. 7 emotions are going to be anger, contempt, aka jealousy, fear, disgust, ew, kind of like you see a cockroach, happiness, maybe you're spending time with friends that brings you joy and laughter, sadness, grief, and surprise or shock. So you can see that all of these emotions operate on a spectrum. So these are the primary 7 emotions that were found through cross-cultural research. Hammingtell was a researcher who traveled to different countries and studied facial expressions. And since his work in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there has been more research being done, especially at the University of Delaware, by an individual named Carol Izard, who is doing more analytically delineated emotions and suggests that there's 12. So again, I find it really helpful to couch it in the 7, but know that it can also expand out. And so in our dreams, we want to notice the feeling tone and the emotional tone of our dreams as a really important way to analyze them for ourselves. So just asking kind of like, was there some anxiety or was there some confusion? So other things that we can write down as potential emotions are going to be joy, surprise, sadness, anger, disgust. You're like, yep, that was the list. And then here's some more. Self-hostility as an emotion. I find that really fascinating. So the idea of self-sabotaging or rumination, fear that overlaps with Hammingtell's list, as well as shame. That's really important. Guilt is different. Guilt is a factual state that we can use in like a court of law, whereas shame is something where you feel like you broke your internal boundary or you've been manipulated to believe that you've broken a boundary. So an example of that might be survivors of sexual trauma can have a lot of shame, and that's different than guilt, right? They didn't actually do anything, but there can be feelings of that. There's also shyness, and so these are being measured via differential emotion scale. So pretty neat. So in the dream world, we want to be kind of assessing feelings and emotions. So application. Oh my gosh, this is where it gets really fun. So 2 terms that come from our text from Whitman and Pereira is applying amplification and association. So amplification is Jung's method for identifying this mythic, historic, cultural analogy. So amplification can foster engagement with deeper resources and personality. But what exactly is amplification? It's the idea that if we feel like we are in a role of being a mother at the moment, then that gets amplified by the myth of all mothers that have ever been, or can be amplified by a cultural myth. So let's say you grow up in New Mexico or parts of Mexico where we talk about La Llorona, right? And La Llorona translates to the crying woman or the crier. And so there's this legacy of a wounding around feminine because of genocide and wars. So in the story, this woman goes mad. And in certain variations in certain regions, she goes mad because her husband left her and, married someone else. And other variations, it's about colonialism. Everyone was murdered except for her children. And so as a result, as a response to that darkness and that heaviness, this archetype represents the hurting of her children, which is the deepest hurting of yourself. So La Llorona is known to be the crying ghost who wanders ditches looking to harm children because she lost her own children by harming them. So you can see how if you're in a dark place in motherhood, that this archetype that already exists in your culture potentially can amplify the feelings. Another example of amplification is, let's say you go to a funeral and you're already feeling grief because you lost someone that you're close to or that you really loved, and you know that your time with them in this incarnation is done and complete, and there's grief. Maybe you cried a few times and you were feeling melancholy, but the moment that you put your energy field, your neural network into a group of other people that are grieving, that creates an amplification of the emotion. So that's how amplification works, is it's kind of like a loudspeaker to something that might have been more quiet. And so that can happen in the dreamscape noticing if other bigger archetypes, whether they're shadow like La Llorona, or whether it's like the healed mother and that very feminine kind of earth goddess, big juicy mama energy comes in, and that can also be amplified. And so again, amplification in a dream setting is just putting a loudspeaker to something because of either a group or historical, mythical, or cultural analogies to your personal unconscious material. Okay, next we have association. So in psychology, it refers to a mental connection between concepts, events, mental states, or groups. So this is really important in analyzing dreams because we all walk around with associations, and some are good and some are not so good. And so understanding what our associations with something that is most likely neutral is a really insightful way to tease apart emotionally what's there for us. So here's an example. Let's say you're a child with a phobia of food, and that phobia started because you were sick at age 3 and had to be hospitalized and had to use feeding tubes instead of solid foods like you were used to or getting used to. And so then as, a 5, 6, 7-year-old, it's really hard for you to try food. And that would be because there's an association with not being able to eat food, and perhaps an association with food trying being dangerous. Another example is a kid choking on candy at the movie theater and being really scared then to go into the movies because of the association of choking, or being scared to eat any candy or anything sweet because of the association of choking, and perhaps the shame that came with that, or the fear that came with that. So we all walk around with associations, both positive and both difficult. And these also live in the both collective and personal unconscious. And they stem from our own personal experiences with something. So our dreamscape allows us to interrogate amplification and association. The last thing I want to get on is just kind of noticing a feeling or an emotion. So, the capacity to experience physical sensations, pain, touch, cold, is often mediated by nerves or organs, aka sensory receptors in the skin, help us experience this capacity. And we know that emotions are chemical, and they absolutely release a cascade of responses in the body, right? When we feel angry, that will let the body know to dump neuroepinephrine or epinephrine into the system. And then the kidneys respond by opening up blood vessels or closing them down. And so cortisol gets produced. So we can see that there's always a cascade in the body when we're in a feeling state or an emotional state. And it takes our brain only a fourth of a second to identify the trigger, and only another fourth of a second to produce the chemicals. So in our dream state, these chemicals can also be emitted. So something really important to know, if when you dream, you are also very sensory oriented. So that is good information to also jot down in dream dictionaries. All right, so today we reviewed shadow and archetypes, two big themes that have come before. We discussed inner work as this tending to ourself that we are always engaged in. It's not like, oh, I tuned into myself in winter. It's like, no, but it's spring, so there's seeds to plant. Or in summer, there's fruit to cultivate. And in winter, it's time to just rest. And so we're always tending to our inner work. We discussed some brain waves and dream states that we access just before sleep and when we sleep. And we also talked about our textbook, which is a really gentle read of just looking at how we can use feeling, association, and amplification to understand our archetypes and shadows that are housed within the collective unconscious or the stratum. All right. Thank you so much for taking some time to tune into yourself. And I cannot wait to share time with you next week.